Since the America colonized the whole nation, the Philippines fought back and adopted the Western life, featuring elegance, liberty, and intelligence among fellow countrymen. Cross-relations of culture, mixing of poetic styles, and literature gave birth to numerous historical heritages and memorable events during the colonization period. Seizing this territory as part of the spoils of victory in the Spanish-American War, America began its ascent as a world power, no longer content to focus its attention on merely continental borders. It thus abandoned the insular policy of manifest destiny and became an active player in the global power games at the turn of the century. Maintaining a colony in Asia required a much more international outlook than had heretofore been necessary and laid the foundation for a fundamental shift in America's sphere of influence. Reproduced with permission of the copyright owner, further reproduction prohibited without permission, and if, then, the colonization of the Philippines was so important, why has it been so neglected as to be all but forgotten in the American consciousness? This study will argue that the colonization foregrounds several fundamental contradictions in American identity, and that it is this uncomfortable irreconcilability between foundational myths and stark reality that has led to the over-determined neglect of the colonization in studies of American culture. Specifically, the colonization challenged the bedrock ideals of American innocence and exceptionalism, racial equality, and the work ethic and self-reliance. The colonization of a people fighting for independence represented a blatant betrayal of all these core values. It has been much easier to stress the victory of the Spanish-American War than to acknowledge the consequences of the spoils of the conflict. There was nothing innocent about the American promise to help the Filipino people fight off the Spanish oppressor only to recolonize them under the American flag. The pride which Americans took in their independence from colonial rule and their distinctly non-European stress on freedom for all was belied by the seizing of a foreign colony and the banning of the Declaration of Independence as a dangerous document. The racial rhetoric accompanying the subjugation of a darker people and the opportunities this afforded for cheap labor in new markets bespoke the American imbrication of capitalism and racism, rather than racial equality and the work ethic, and fighting a 3-year war reproduced against a people fighting desperately for independence made a mockery of the professed American belief in self-reliance. On the other hand, what the Filipino writers actually say in their writings underscores what every teacher in the classroom knows, that what is taught is not necessarily what is learned, and the student will always bring his or her unique advantage point to the desk which cannot be erased or subsumed even in such an unbalanced power structure. In this video, we are trying to strike two distinct middle grounds. The first is an active tension between the American and Filipino viewpoints, and also the history of political and the mediocre happenings with touch of arts. The second is an acknowledgement of the deep impact on Filipino culture caused by the American colonization, while still clearing an autonomous space for the Filipino voice of resistance to the colonization. In addition to American influences, caricatures and other art-related products brought up the historical era which Philippines would not forget about the Americans aside from war. The influence of using art and the intellect of artists to portray their sides and comments about certain political views, as well as real-life narratives of Filipino life, put into shades and strokes of a pen. Even on late presidencies and administrations, the American influence paved way to tribunal, sovereign, and international amnesties, hearings, and final verdicts. The assigned group of the second chapter of studies will present you the topic of content and contextual analysis of selected primary sources in Philippine history, with our selected phases showcasing you the hot topics consisting of relevant research and careful analyzations.
The Magellan Route is the route used by Ferdinand Magellan on his first voyage around the world. It is universal and worldwide route since it runs through all the major oceans and all the continents in both hemispheres of the globe.
The Magellan Route the path taken by the first globe circumnavigation, which took place at the turn of 16th century. This journey was organized and led by Ferdinand Magellan, one of the world's most extraordinary explorers and sailors, who for the first time charted not only a new and vast ocean, the Pacific, which was then fully navigated for the first time, but also the straits that connected the world's two largest oceans, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Since it was the only possible path for ships until the completion of Panama Canal in the 20th century, this route was used for 4 centuries to connect the east and the west over the sea. This universal route's significant contribution to human history may be seen not only in the voyage itself, but also in the historical context of the voyage and the implications it had on the development of numerous civilizations. Such a remarkable journey must be understood in the context of a common historical period between Portugal and Spain. Both were sealess researchers who learned a great deal about nautical technology, cartography, and astronomy, as well as other subjects linked to maritime exploration. The navigation route designed by Magellan and his sailors during the first circumnavigation around the world has geographically and symbolically linked different cultures and civilizations since the beginning of the 16th century, allowing for exchanges and achievements in commerce, scientific knowledge, cultural, artistic, and religious practices. It may be claimed that was the beginning of our world's first globalization.
So for the first time, people became aware of the multicultural fact because multiculturalism was empirically demonstrated as the diversity of people and cultures who met one another, as evidenced by the inclusion and audacity of an almost unnamed participant in the Magellan expedition, the Italian Antonio Pigafetta, who left a diary like written records of the voyage, where he reported day by day recalling events.
The Chronicle of Pigafetta was one of the most cited documents by historians who wish to study the pre-colonial Philippines. As one of the earliest written accounts, Pigafetta was seen as a credible source for a period, which was prior unchronicled and undocumented. Herein, what is Pigafetta's account?
Also to know is, what is the purpose of Antonio Pigafetta? Pigafetta also describes how to take the altitude of the pole star to determine latitude, know the wind direction and other minor navigation problems. Mistakenly believed that the direction of the compass coincided with the meridian of Iron Island.
Pigafetta kept a detailed journal, the original of which is lost, but based on this original journal, 4 manuscripts were produced, 3 in French and 1 in Latin. Pigafetta's work is important not only as a source of information about the voyage itself, but also includes an early Western description of the people and languages of the Philippines.
Ang kataas-taasang kagalang-galangang katipunan ng anak ng mga bayan ay isa sa mga organisasyon na pinakamalaga dito sa Pilipinas.
Habang ang kilusan, pag-iisip at ordinasyong anti-kolonyal ay naitatag ng isang siglo bago ang pagkatatag ng katipunan. Ang samaang ito lamang nag-isip ng isang nakakaisang bansang Pilipino na mag-alsa laban sa mga Kastila para sa kabuuang kalayaan ng bansa mula sa Espanya.
Sa pagsasagawa ng kanilang pakikibaka, lumikha ang katipunan ng isang komplikadong istruktura at isang tinukoy na sistema na halaga ng gagabay sa organisasyon bilang isang kolektibong naghahangad ng isang layunin.
Maraming salamat kay Ginoong Edmar Makahilig sa kanyang pagpapahayag tungkol sa nilalaman ng kartilya ng Katipunan. Ngayon, nais ko naman po sa inyo ipahayag sa inyo ang aking pagsusuri tungkol sa mga nilalaman nito. Kaya, ito ang nilalaman ng kartilya ng Katipunan. Meron po ito ng 14 na linya at ang mga nilalaman nito ang dapat nakatangian ng isang katipunero. Kartilya ng katipunan ay isinagawa upang magsilbing gabay sa mga magiging miyembro ng katipunan. Ito ay isinagawa ni Emilio Jacinto. Si Andres Bonifacio ay gumawa din ng isa pang bersyon nito, ngunit ang bersyon ni Emilio Jacinto ang nagsilbing gabay kasi mas nagiging epektibo itong nagsilbing gabay sa mga bagong katipunero at upang sila ay magkakatiwala. Magbibigay ako ng isang halimbawa ng isang linya ng kartilya ng katipunan. Ang unang linya nun ay nagpapahiwatig ang isang puno na walang anino ay parang nagsisilbing masamang damo. So ang ibig sabihin nun, kapag isang katipunero ay may silbing magkaroon ng plano, ngunit wala naman siyang responsibilidad, nagmumukha lang siyang ginagawa mo. Kasi ano pa ba magiging silbi ng isang katipunero kung hindi naman niya ginagawa ang kanyang katungkulan at kanyang responsibilidad upang ipaglaban ang kanyang bansa sa mga kamay ng Espanyol. Kaya ginawa ito upang mapalaya tayo sa kanila at pagsiklab ang isang magandang rebellion upang magkaroon tayo ng magandang pamumuhay. Kaya kung ako, kapag ako ay magiging isang pinuno ng katipunan, alangan gagawin ko talaga dapat ang kartilya ng katipunan. Halimbawa ito, ang hari o isang pyesa ng aheadress. Siya ang pinuno, ang mag-uutos sa kanyang mga tauhan upang makipaglaban sa kanyang kalaban na balak siyang wasakin at gawing alipin. Ang halimbawa nito ay ampon. Di ba alam naman natin ampon sa chess ng Katina? Isipin mo ito ang bagong katipunero. Pero kapag sa oras na ginabayan siya ng hari, magkakaroon doon ng isang napakalaking potensyal. Di ba kapag inabot mo na to sa dulo ng kanyang board, posible siya maging kabalyero o kaya maging pastor. Kaya kita mo ang tatlong pare o yung gumbusa ay lumaban din para sa ating bansa. At atong mga kabalyero natin, sila naman ang ating mga matatapang na mandirigma na lumaban para sa ating bansa laban sa mga kamay ng masasamang Espanyol na nang alipin sa ating bansa na sa loob ng 300 taon. Kaya maraming salamat.
Every year, the country commemorates the anniversary of the Philippine Independence Proclaim on June 12, 1898 in the province of Cavite. The declaration was a short 2,000-word document which was summarized the reason behind the revolution against Spain, the war for independence, and the future of the new republic under Emilio Aguinaldo.
Reading the details on the said document is selling the kind of government that was created under Emilio Aguinaldo and the forthcoming hand of the United States of America in the next few years of the newly created republic. The document began with a brief overview of the Spanish occupation of the islands from Magellan's arrival in Visayas until the Philippine Revolution. It also implies that the established republic will be led under the dictatorship of Emilio Aguinaldo. In the documentary, it is the spread of movement like an electric spark through different southern provinces like Bataan and Pampanga. The quick decline of Spanish forces in Batangas, Bulacan, Laguna, and Moro, and in the same provinces ensured the independence of the country. Historically accurate meaning behind the most widely known national symbol in the Philippines. It is not known by many, for example, that the white triangle was derived from the symbol of the Katipunan. The red and blue colors of the flag are often associated with courage and peace.
Respectively, our basic education omits from the flag of the United States. While it can always be argued that symbolic meaning can always change and be reinterpreted, the original symbolic meaning of something presents several historic truths that can explain the subsequent events which unfolded after the declaration of the independence on the June 12, 1898.
The Declaration of Philippine Independence or Declaración de Independencia de Filipinas was proclaimed on the year 1998 of June 12 in Cavite El Viejo, which is now called Cavite Cavite, located in the Philippines, at the balcony of General Emilio Aguinaldo's residence.
Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista, also known as Don Boshong, wrote the Declaration of Philippine Independence, which was later translated by Sulpicio Guevara, a novelist born in 1904. Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista was born on December 7, 1830 in Biñan, Laguna, Captain General of the Philippines. The War Counselor and Special Delegate Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista announced and solemnized the Declaration of Philippine Independence on behalf of the dictatorial government of the Philippines, pursuant to and by virtue of a decree issued by the invidious dictator, Don Emilio Aguinaldo y Fami. A total of 98 people signed the proclamation. Thousands of people from all across the province gathered in Cavite to witness the historic event. Military personnel, representatives from other municipalities, and other public officials were present to witness the historic ceremony. The purpose of this statement is to proclaim the Philippines' sovereignty and independence from the Spanish Empire's colonization. The Declaration of Philippine Independence is a document released by the Philippine government. This document's objective is to remind ourselves, the colonists, and the whole world that the Philippines declared independence from the colonizers. The proclamation listed a number of grievances against the Spanish government, stretching back to the arrival of explorer Ferdinand Magellan in 1521. The Declaration of Philippine Independence is significant in our country since it establishes our country's independence from colonial rule. This document summarizes and explains all of the events that occurred throughout the colony's 300-year conquest.
This government-issued document can demonstrate that our country and ourselves were freed from colonial rule, implying that we have the right to live without any restrictions and with equality. It teaches us to be more independent and to fight for ourselves and our country so that we can exercise our right to live in freedom, peace, and unity with others.
The analysis of the political caricatures during the American period, the transition from the Spanish colonial period to the American occupation period demonstrated different strands of changes and shifts in culture, society, and politics. The America drastically introduced democracy to the nascent nation, and the consequences were far from being trivial.
Aside from this, it was also during the American period that Filipinos were introduced to different manifestations of modernity, like healthcare, modern transportation, and media. This ushered in a more and open, freer press. The post-independence and the post-Filipino-American period in the Philippines were experienced differently by Filipinos coming from different classes. The upper principal class experienced economic prosperity with the opening up of the Philippine economy to the United States, but the majority of the poor Filipino remained poor, desperate, and victims of state repression. The selected cartoons illustrate not only the opinion of repression. The selected cartoons illustrate not only the opinion of certain media outfits about the Philippine society during the American period but also paint a broad image of society and politics under the United States. The transition from a Catholic-centered Spanish-Filipino society to an Imperial American assimilated one and its complications were also depicted in the cartoons. One example is the unprecedented increase of motorized vehicles in the city. Automobiles become popular, a mode of transportation in the city led to the emergence of taxis. However, the laws and policy implementation were mediocre. This resulted in the increasing colorum and unlicensed vehicles transporting people around the city. The rules governing the issuance of the driver's license was loose, and traffic police could not be bothered by rampant violations of traffic rules. This is a direct consequence of the drastic urbanization of the Philippine society. Another example is what McCoy called the sexual revolution that occurred in the 1930s.
An example of work emerged in this era is entitled The Loyalty of the Filipinos, or The Independent, of 14th of April 1970, page 104, quoted as World War I sparked an outburst of pro-American loyalty among Filipinos and transformed Uncle Sam's media image. The pre-war cartoons of 1907 to 1908 showed him as a satanic monster, drawn in Caucasian caricature with great nose, fanged teeth, and crooked smile. These three cartoons from war and post-war issues of the nationalist newspaper The Independent, by contrast, showed him as a figure worthy of Filipino love and respect.
We have here cartoons, political caricature of the American era from 1900 to 1941. So before we start from our main topic, have you thought about what is a caricature? Well then, a caricature is a picture, description, or imitation of a person in which certain characteristics are exaggerated in order to make a comic.
First, let's talk about the writer Alfred McCoy. Alfred McCoy was born on June 8, 1945 in Massachusetts, USA, an American citizen, aging 76 years old and still alive. He's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and also a director of Southeast Asian Studies. That's why he got to study the caricature in our country. He also specialized in Philippine political history. He is also the author of many more projects like Politics of Heroine in Southeast Asia, Philippine Cartoon, Closer Than Brothers, and one of his famous books, Cartoons, Political Caricature of the American Era from 1900 to 1941. In this book, we will know how the political environment worked during the American era. Now, just so you know that he did not draw the cartoons, but he gave the idea and analysis of the works during American era. This book earns a lot of awards like Philippine Catholic Mass Media Award, Best Book of the Year 1995, and Philippine National Book Award for History 1986. Moving on to Alfredo Roses, which is the co-author from the known Roses clan in the Philippine print media and a journalist of a famous newspaper. They are both awesome authors with awesome awards. Now, we are going to look at one of the famous books they've made, Cartoons, Political Caricature of the American Era from 1900 to 1941. A public post is not a hereditary crown and was published by The Independent on May 20, 1916. It shows a politician from Tondo passing his crown to his brother-in-law. A Filipino guy wearing salakot and barong Tagalog was trying to stop the other man, telling to stop giving the crown because it is not him to begin with. The second one is War Against Speculators, drawn by Fernando Amersala and was also published by The Independent on June 16, 1917. A Filipino child stole a chicken because he had nothing anymore. The police officer is getting the child for stealing. A man wearing salakot grabbing the police officer, telling to leave the small child and focus on the great thieves instead, pointing at a big warehouse containing a box of rice, milk, and grocery products. Last one for our example, Colorum. Colorum was a commentary published by the Philippine Free Press when fatal accidents involving colorum vehicles and taxis occurred often already.
The way of how people in the Philippines interpret things transitioned as the Spanish colonial era came to an end and the American era took over, which resulted in changes in Philippine society, culture, beliefs, and politics.
The Americans introduced ways on how the Philippines can have more freedom in its press. An author named Alfred McCoy, who has been studying and writing about Southeast Asian history and politics, he published numerous books which includes The Politics, which was about the situation of the country during the American colonialism, compared to the Spanish era and other problems which the society were currently facing at that time. The Philippine cartoons were a compilation of 300 plus editorial cartoons and caricatures that were made by Filipino authors and artists that talks about the situation of the entire country when the Americans came and started their colonialism. These caricatures recorded the ups and downs of being a Filipino citizen during the American era, due to some of it being about the country's functionality change and some saying that the Philippines are going through a path that would benefit the country in the long run. The cartoons also tackled the detailed situation of the Filipinos, especially in the field of work, like how the wages, taxes, and opportunities were unequal across the workers, despite having the same standpoint. The caricatures also depicted the discrimination between the two races and how the Americans are enslaving the Filipinos by them doing most of the work while they take all the credits given from it. Having these things as basis, the Philippine cartoons and caricatures progressed through time. Yet,
having these cartoons topics being about politics and government situations still remain which numbers increased even further as the media and press gained more freedom and as the country approached towards its independence.
Nangyari ang talumpati ni dating Presidente Corazon Cory Aquino noong ika-18 ng Setyembre taong 1986 habang naka-joint session ng Kongreso ng Estados Unidos. Ilang buwan pa lang ang nakakalipas matapos mapatalsik ng dating diktador na si Ferdinand Marcos Sr.
Ikunento niya nga dito ang dahilan ng paglisa niya sa Amerika 3 taon na ang nakakalipas. Dahil nga ito sa pagpatay sa kanyang asawa na si dating Senador Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., isa sa mga nasa oposisyon at kritiko ng dating diktador. Sinabi din niya dito kung paano pinahirapan ng dating diktador ang mga taong nananawagan ng demokrasya kagaya ng ilang mga senador at mga publisher. Inilahad niya din dito ang kanyang pagsali sa eleksyon na ipinatawag ng dating diktador at ang naging pandaraya sa resulta ng eleksyon na isa sa mga naging sanhi ng People Power Revolution na naging matagumpay dahil sa pagtutulungan ng mga ordinaryong mamamayan at matataas na opisyal ng militar. At noong naitalaga na nga siya bilang Pangulo, nagbalik na ang demokrasya sa Pilipinas. Nangako siya na tutugunan niya ang problema sa komunismo nang hindi marahas. Ilan pa sa mga pangako niya ang pagresolba sa kahirapan at kawalan ng trabaho.
Natapos ang kanyang talumpati sa pagsasabing kaisa ng Amerika ang Pilipinas sa pagkakaroon ng demokrasya na kinakailangan upang makamit ang kalayaan.
Noong September 18, 1986, halos 7 buwan matapos siyang maging ika-11 Pangulo ng Republika ng Pilipinas, si Maria Corazon Cory Aquino ay nagbigay ng talumpati bago ang joint session ng Kongreso ng Estados Unidos sa Washington, D.C.
The speech of Corazon Aquino was influenced by the situation of the country after Marcos administration. The country was left in an oppressed situation for more over than 1 decade. This caused the Filipino citizens to be left and be burdened with the debt committed by Marcos during his regime, which they did not receive any benefit from. The dust after the martial law was only starting to settle, but the Philippines was reckoning with everything Marcos' administration had inflicted. That included $26 billion in total foreign debt and a communist insurgency that grew throughout the Marcos era, from 500 armed guerrillas to 16,000. The Philippines had no enough means to compensate for the debt. Hence, Corazon filed an appeal for financial aid from the United States Congress. Moreover, since the Filipino people had really fought hard against the administration to free the country as well as themselves, Corazon wanted to preserve the freedom that Filipinos want for themselves. Therefore, in her speech, she also expressed her plea of help to aid the Philippines financially in its road to constitutional and economic recovery. She delivered a historic speech that managed to sway in our favor the vote for an emergency $200 million aid appropriation. The document is relevant in the Philippine history, especially in the diplomatic and political history, since this has arguably cemented the legitimacy of the EDSA government in the international arena. Moreover, the ideology of the new democratic government can also be seen in the same speech. Furthermore, this document contributed to the Philippines' history as it also traced back for the first step. In my opinion, looking at her speech in today's perspective, I have observed that what had happened in the past the America helping the Philippines was somewhat a give-and-take relationship. It seemed like Cory Aquino really trusted the America out of all the countries worldwide. That was why she lodged an appeal for help from the U.S. Congress in the recovery and the preservation. Subsequently of this, the Philippine favor from democracy, the Americas somewhat resulted for the Philippines to have some sense of obligation to return the favor. Thus, the assistance from the U.S. Congress during the recovery state of the Philippines from dictatorship may also seem like somewhat a strategic political plan.
Talagang kapanapanag ang katotohanan na ang demokrasya at kalayaan ay mahalaga sa mga Pilipino kaysa sa kanilang socio-economic na sitwasyon. Ang mga tao ay may matibay na pagpapahalaga at paniniwala na hindi nila hahayaang abusuin ng mga mapang-api ang kanilang mga karapatan at pribilehiyo bilang mamamayan ng bansa.